think. Good morning from Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience. Welcome back to the conference towards open and inclusive regionalism. This conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. This CSIS-GRIPS-RSIS conference is part of the Policy Research Network of Contemporary Southeast Asia, PRN-SEA, a policy research project by GRIPS Japan in collaboration with the universities and research institutes in ASEAN. My name is Rocky Intan, and I will continue to be your host for this second day of this virtual event. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to remind participants joining us here at Zoom that we have an interpretation feature in this Zoom in this conference, which you can access in the right-hand corner of your Zoom application. And I would also like to announce a quick rundown of today's event. We will directly proceed with the 3 remaining sessions of today's event, namely Maritime Security, Connectivity, and Sustainable Development Goals. Before further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Jane Chan from RSIS to moderate our first session of Maritime Security. Ms. Jane Chan is a Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Her main research interests include maritime security issues in Southeast Asia, law and order at the sea, regional maritime cooperation and confidence building measures, and regional boundary limitation and territorial disputes. Jane, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Gilang, for that kind introduction. Very good morning, one and all. Please allow me to first say a few words of thanks to the organizers, CSIS, GRIPS, and of course my colleagues at RSIS for the invitation. We are at panel 4, which will focus on maritime cooperation. We heard yesterday in the other sessions assessments on vexing regional and international developments with panelists and participants as well, sharing their perspective on pushing forward with cooperation within the basic premise of an open and inclusive regionalism. So we in this panel will dwell a bit more into the positive theme of cooperation and to look specifically on maritime cooperation, yeah? So the panelists with me today were given a rather difficult task of needing to cover a very broad range of issues, such as what is the best way to promote maritime cooperation in specific areas, such as maritime security, prevention of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, energy developments, and protection of the marine environment. Within that scope, we are not only talking about cooperation within ASEAN, we wish to also consider avenues to enhance maritime cooperation between ASEAN dialogue partners and ASEAN. So as if these were not enough, we have also heard specific questions being raised yesterday on ASEAN's maritime priorities as well, such as whether maritime domain awareness is important and a priority to ASEAN, and whether ASEAN can strengthen existing maritime cooperation mechanisms without forming new ones. In my view, these issues are in themselves not new. And lucky for us today, we have 3 eminent experts in this panel who has been following this issue closely and will share their thoughts and assessment on the topic at hand. We will start with 2 speakers, following by a discussant. First up will be Rear Admiral Romeo Jude Ong. The Good Admiral is currently a professor of praxis at the Ateneo School of Government in the Philippines. Prior to that, he was assigned to various senior command and staff positions before retiring as the Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy in 2019. Following Rear Admiral Ong will be an old friend from Vietnam, Dr. Nguyen Thilanan, who is currently the Director General of the East Asia Institute at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, DAV in short. She was the longtime Vice Dean of the International Law Faculty at the DAV before leaving for a short diplomatic stint a few years ago. Serving as discussant in this panel today is Dr. Alex Bristol. Dr. Bristol is currently a Deputy Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI's Defence Strategy and National Security Program. Before that, he was with the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Given the limited time that we have in this panel, I do aspire to be a good timekeeper. May I kindly ask our speakers to limit their remarks to 10 minutes each, and for Dr. Bristol to share his comment in 8 minutes. Without further ado, Iimura Ong, your 10 minutes starts now. Please, sir.
Thank you, Jane. May I ask Rocky to share the slide? So I frame my topic as a maritime security cooperation in the South China Sea, basically to provide a tighter context to the discussion. But I think the process itself in the discussion could be replicated in other areas. Next slide, please. So maritime security, before we talk of cooperation, we need to look at what maritime security is among the different stakeholders within ASEAN and outside of ASEAN. Yes, next slide, please. So as you can see, there are different ways of skinning the cat in terms of what is maritime security among different stakeholders. And I would presume that among different member states, they also have their own way of looking at things in terms of maritime security. Next slide, please. So over the years, there were different mechanisms or bodies that were organized and still existing within and outside of ASEAN that are delving into matters of maritime security. And I put out there the alphabet soup of different acronyms representing different mechanisms and bodies that have different mandates and different areas of concern in terms of maritime security. So next slide, please. Now we look at challenges to cooperation. Okay, and these are challenges within the member states and within ASEAN itself. So I think we have to consider one, how we look at our own geography vis-a-vis how the maritime environment plays into it. Example, there are parts of ASEAN that are landlocked, and I think their idea of maritime would be different. Then we have to look at the political part, the leadership, and of course, how the foreign policy is constructed within the different member states. Economic relations, structural, the institutional dynamics in the respective bureaucracies. And I'm sure for some archipelagic states like the Philippines, who have army-centric militaries, they share our concern or our problem of having to deal with resource management. I mean, you are an archipelagic state, and yet most of the resources are provided to ground forces. Then there are security priorities in terms of maritime types of security concerns versus other non-traditional concerns that are equally important, and it changes from state to state. Then, of course, there's that strategic competition between US and China, which is always there. It's the elephant in the room in all discussions. And if you look at ASEAN itself, basing on the literature that I've read, we've created mechanisms that are stovepipe. Question is, are they talking to each other? Then there's the complaint of too many meetings, too little time, and too few people to attend those meetings. So those are the little things that creates problems for cooperation to take place. I mean, substantive cooperation to take place. Next slide, please. I realized that if we go to the discussion in session 1, the first session yesterday, there's an aversion to looking at US-China strategic competition from ASEAN perspective. But I have to put it out there. You, as a naval professional, and my training, my mental model is to look at how other countries think in terms of strategy and how they do want to implement it. So from for China, I think, and its maritime objectives are very clear, and there are 4 of them. But I will only delve into one, which is sea control. I believe that one of their objectives is sea control over the north, the east, and the South China Sea. There are only 3 ways of dealing with maritime strategy. It's either you aspire for command of the sea, you aspire for sea control, or you aspire for sea denial. So I think here we can rightfully place that Chinese maritime strategy is anchored on sea control. Now, the enablers of sea control, as far as I'm concerned, are 3: the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the militia. But for the purpose of this, my presentation, I will only focus on the militia itself. And that will be evident in how the discourse comes to later on. Next slide, please. I try to create a framework for the mental model I'm looking at in terms of all the things that are going on. So ASEAN is not the only player in town or the only game in town. There are things moving. There are many moving pieces as far as maritime security is concerned. And I try to sort it out into who are the players as far as maritime security. The first one would be the member state itself, engage in bilateral activities. Then you have the ASEAN Plus, which is ASEAN plus dialogue partners. You have ASEAN only, and of course, the new phenomenon that's coming in with minilaterals or the ASEAN minus. Okay. And I try to sort it out again in terms of what activities these players are doing. So you have the traditional concerns, the non-traditional security concerns, you have maritime domain awareness, and of course, capacity building. Now here, I block off traditional security concern for ASEAN Plus, ASEAN, and ASEAN minus. My point being, traditional security concerns are being addressed by the member states by themselves. And I take the example of the Philippines. As far as we're concerned, since ASEAN could not be the proper mechanism for us to address traditional concerns, we do it on a bilateral basis. So I think you're well aware of the Philippine-US alliance. Then we have recently the 2+2 with Japan. And just this month, we just concluded the discussion between Japan, the United States, and the Philippines, which I think is a precursor towards a more or less a trilateral arrangement between the 3 countries. Now, then you have the ASEAN Plus, ASEAN, and the ASEAN Minus. We can deep dive this framework if you want during the Q&A. In the interest of time, I will move forward. Next slide, please. So I think that we can safely say that ASEAN and even ASEAN Plus is primarily predisposed toward non-traditional concerns. Okay. And most of its mechanisms and bodies created and still existing gravitate towards addressing non-traditional concerns. In a sense, it is the comfort zone where we all can have a conversation and talk about cooperation. Okay, next slide. Now, allow me now to outline the broad strokes of what I think would be a workable cooperation framework within the context of ASEAN. Now, for ASEAN Plus mechanisms, I think it should be a neutral ground for everybody, since we have invited other partners outside of ASEAN. I hate to use the word talk shop, but I think that is what it should be, a talk shop. And it should be postured as an interlocutor so to major power competition, meaning somebody that can referee the 2 major powers. Okay. And focus only on benign activities like HADR and maybe marine scientific research. The other aspects that are in the ASEAN Plus maybe move back to ASEAN-only type mechanisms. Okay, and they could be consolidated. Maritime security initiatives could be consolidated under the ADMM. You have the ASEAN Navy Chiefs. You have the ADM Expert Working Group on Maritime Security. And you have the ASEAN Our Eyes mechanism, which is a pattern after the 5 Eyes, purely for intelligence sharing. My only concern here is that it seems to have focused on counterterrorism, where I think from my previous life as a naval intelligence officer, it shouldn't be focused on one concern only. I mean, part of intelligence is forecasting problems in the future. Okay, and I don't think that stovepiping to one area is the right direction to go. Then you have the maritime domain awareness, and here I bring in an existing facility, which is the Singapore's Changi Information Fusion Center into the narrative. And I think the ASEAN should focus on naval exercises, intelligence exchange, and maybe shipbuilding. We talked of RCEP yesterday, and looking at a regional supply chain. Okay? And maybe this is one area to work on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll be wrapping up. This is my last slide. Second to the last slide. So for the things that the ASEAN cannot do, I think the best direction would be a unilateral arrangement. But the problem is this something that the ASEAN would like to do by itself, because it can happen with or without ASEAN intervention. Okay, so we look at that the Indo-Malfi PCA Indo-Malfi as a template, and here I propose 3 options: either an ASEAN only arrangement, an ASEAN plus arrangement, or an ASEAN with a middle power arrangement. And last slide, please, Rocky. I chose the unilateral option of an ASEAN minus plus a middle power. And I'm looking here for just an example. I'm looking at Japan. It's an example of a dialogue partner that an ASEAN minus can work with to address the issues of IUUF, protection of fishing activities, protection of oil and gas exploration, and enforcement of maritime environment protocols. And there are 3 components that we can look at. And that is a Coast Guard forum, which is already, it started out, but it fizzled out. But there is an existing one, actually, what we call the Southeast Asian Maritime Law Enforcement Initiative. Problem is, it's a US-led initiative. But it is something that we can work on. For maritime domain awareness, we already have the Changi Information Future Center of the Singapore that we can work on. And we can connect our different MDA centers. The Philippines has 3. One for fisheries, one for naval, and one for Coast Watch. Okay. And I presume that other countries have their own MDA centers that can be connected to Changi. We can decide to join RECAP, and later on we can decide to join the nascent Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative as well. The last component would be an MLSA, or a logistics agreement, that can help share the support system to others within the context of a Coast Guard forum. So it will be a sharing in terms of facilities, supplies, materials, fuel, that can help the participants. Okay. With that, I close, and thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong, for giving us a very broad overview in terms of the issues, the maritime issues that our regional countries face. An assessment of existing mechanisms and institutions, a lot of them overlapping, a lot of them non-effective, of course. And most valuable, of course, is that you've put up some new proposal in terms of cooperative models, right? Be it ASEAN with a dialogue partner, or actually ASEAN minus X plus a dialogue partners. Essentially, what I draw from it is that it is important for us to draw on partners of interest, right? Of common interest, with common interest coming together, targeting a specific issue. Very pragmatic, but we look forward to comments and from participants in terms of your proposal. Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Nguyen. You also have 10 minutes. Floor is yours. Are you here?
Thank you very much, Jane. Speak already mentioned the current mechanism of maritime cooperation ASEAN, I actually did the same job with him to review all the current mechanism and see that actually the maritime cooperation idea has been widely promoted in all of the ASEAN fora, well as mentioned important ASEAN documents. Cooperation were mainly implemented through discussion at perhaps functional technical workshops, reaching joint statements, grand action plan and guidelines at ministerial level, establishing focal points, conducting tabletop exercise and field training exercise. So those are the kind that maritime cooperation has been conducted so far in different maritime forum and different kind of mechanism within ASEAN. So it's very important in shaping for ideas, coordinating in policy and building trust among each other. However, unfortunately, it's insufficient to address the deterioration of the marine environment as well as the rapid development in the field. So therefore, when I saw the topic, how to promote maritime cooperation, maritime security cooperation, particularly in maritime security, in IUU fishing, in marine environment protection, etc. I think that, it is both a new topic. We have been talking and we've been trying to promote the maritime corporations for so many times. And the root cause for the current situation is because the existence of bilateral and multilateral sovereignty and maritime dispute. Whenever the idea of cooperation comes up, it's always difficult to raise where and how to cooperate. It's very difficult, especially it involved with China, to be honest, because the claim China is, as the previous speaker has mentioned, is cover most of the South China Sea and is really not rooted in the common legal basis with the other ASEAN claimants. However, we are fortunate enough to have the South China Sea Arbitral Award, in which is rule out the legal basics of the 9-dash line, and it also limits the actual disputed maritime zones in the South China Sea. The rest is actually laying with the ASEAN claimant to see whether the claimant would love to seize the opportunity, would love to apply the award to find a way to promote cooperation among themselves. So therefore, my first recommendation is the best way to promote maritime cooperation among ASEAN is to speed up its negotiation for dispute management mechanism, including the interim measure or the like energies cooperation in the area that or they already have the clear guidelines from the arbitration award. To be concrete, perhaps the maritime delimitation between Philippines and Malaysia, for example, or Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam will have to pave the way for further cooperation between ASEAN, South China Sea littoral state. And even after or before maritime delimitation, ASEAN country always can find a way to cooperate based on UNCLOS, or they can negotiate to find the mechanism for dispute management between them. But otherwise, because we always have to take into account the presence of China, the interest of China, and of course we would wish that China will participate in any form of maritime cooperation in the regions. And therefore, the second recommendation will rest on learning from the good practices and expanding the successful bilateral, trilateral cooperation that we already have in the past in our regions. And to that extent, I would love to come into a different specific area that have been highlighted in the sections. So first, for maritime security, building upon the good work of ARF, ADMM, ADMM+, AMF and EAMF, and responding to the need of economic recovery post the pandemic, the cooperation in maritime security perhaps should focus on the establishment of ASEAN's single shipping market by realizing the rural connections. And perhaps it is still quite broad. Therefore, my concrete recommendation when we can focus on the area of applying technologies, new technology, or investing in infrastructure toward net zero shipping. It is also address the commitment that many countries in our regions made after COP26, and specifically apply to maritime areas that's shipping, where many countries in the region have the strength of providing logistic services in that industry. And perhaps in addition to cooperation toward net zero shipping, we can also continue to conduct FTX, that field training exercise, and HADR exercise in order to protect seafarers' right. This right of seafarer is not a new area, but taking into account the new context of the extremely impacts of climate change, as well as the context of the pandemic, then the seafarer right is also an area old but new in the new context and should be addressed as an area for priority. In the second area of IUU fishing, in addition to the measures highlighted in the ASEAN CFDEC Joint Declaration, that perhaps interagency cooperation would be promoted, especially between law enforcement forces. I agree with our Coast Guard meeting, Coast Guard negotiation, or Coast Guard cooperation. Before we have the idea raised by Indonesia, and recently we have the initiative by the Philippines, and perhaps if the Coast Guard in the region can somewhat form in the way of joint patrol in preventing not only IUU fishing, but also preventing or joint patrol in order to address the transnational crime, which is re-emerged in the context of COVID context, is also a very helpful idea for promoting cooperation. In the area of energy cooperation, perhaps there are two ways of cooperation. The first one, to stick with traditional energy cooperation in the form of joint development. We have the successful practice between Vietnam and Malaysia, or Malaysia and Thailand. So those are the practice that we can build upon to expand to the other area where we have the overlapping maritime zones between the littoral state in the South China Sea, with the note again mentioned to the country in the southern part, where we can apply the conclusion of the Abidjan Accord to promote the maritime demilitarization, or to apply joint development as an interim measures. But energy cooperation can also be conducted with the renewable energies. In the context of new commitment under COP26, renewable energies is an area that required a lot of investment for new technologies, and in this context, offshore wind, solar energies may be a new feasible area for cooperation in energy cooperation. The next one, and which is the last one on the list, which is maritime environment protections. Perhaps the success of the two programs in conservations, like marine-based ASEAN heritage parks and integrated river-based basin management, should be expanded in combination of the targeting climate change's impact and marine debris. Remind us about the situation of marine debris in the regions. We have Indonesia and Vietnam among the most suffer from maritime debris, especially the plastic debris. So therefore, build upon the two conservation programs and expand to the area of environment protection. Perhaps it will draw a lot of attention and address the need in reality of this country in the region. And the second big questions that raised in our panel is the role of ASEAN dialogue partner in promoting maritime cooperation. Definitely yes. At the moment, we have 10 ASEAN dialogue partners, and each of them will have the strength toward maritime cooperation, either providing the resources, the technologies, or just providing the new initiative. So in that way, perhaps if we look at the practice, we already see the ASEAN dialogue partner have been very active and very well demonstrated their interest in the current mechanism. But my recommendation will be perhaps we can build upon the success of the cooperation projects within DOC between ASEAN and China on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can explore the new linkage between ASEAN-led maritime cooperation program, new minilateral initiative like IPMDA. IPMDA also very much interested in IUU fishing, and also, like the previous speaker already mentioned, the information sharing, which is very important for all the area of maritime cooperation. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and looking forward for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen. Apart from just addressing all the, conventional themes, I think a lot of your recommendations are actually, pushing us to think outside of the box. For example, energy, not just thinking about joint development in oil and gas, but in fact, renewable as well. And indeed, a call for, thinking outside of the box in terms of how we collaborate with extra-regional partners. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Dr. Bristol, who will be the discussant. And Dr. Bristol, you have 8 minutes to share with us your comment and assessment, please. Dr. Bristol.
Thanks very much. There's so much to pick up on. I'm going to miss large parts, so my apologies in advance, but I'll do my best. Maybe just to start on, I think that the two speakers definitely touched on many of the same points, so I won't try and identify specific speakers, but there was quite a lot about the range of organizations that are involved, and whether that is a problem. I think someone referred to it as an alphabet soup. I think there's probably some bits of the alphabet we could even add to that. If you look at Indo-Pacific wide organizations like the Quad, has now a maritime agreement from the last summit, and perhaps even the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is led by India but has multiple partners around the region. Some of these have quite variable geographies, and so could very much be relevant to areas of ASEAN's concern. So maybe there's even more to the alphabet than we originally saw. And of course, I think one of the speakers mentioned some so-called plurilaterals or minilaterals like the Philippines, Japan, US initiative. I mean, there are many of those. I know that Australia's in one with Japan and Indonesia, for instance. So it's a really complicated picture, and there are obviously concerns about stovepiping and overload. But I was interested whether there might also be some positives to this. So I'll send a link afterwards, but there is some research from the University of Bristol on how the amount of complexity in overlapping, it's by someone called Scott Edwards, the complexity in overlapping institutions in Southeast Asia might actually be building trust, that you're having the same conversation across various formats with the same actors. It actually brings some benefits. So a question maybe for the panelists to consider on the pros and cons of so many organizations. China came up various times. I think that's absolutely obvious why. I think people recognized from the discussion yesterday that there was a gap in the rhetoric between the rhetoric and actions of China in this region. And they're just simply not behaving in a way that can generate much trust. I did wonder whether there were some additional mechanisms to the 2016 arbitral awards that we might want to be looking at. The process for submissions to the UN Commission on the Limits to the Continental Shelf, which I think Malaysia, perhaps some others, certainly Australia, have been involved with, might be another way for people to clarify certain claims and views on the types of features that can generate territorial waters, for instance. But I mean, I think, as was rightly pointed out, one of the fundamental problems for maritime cooperation is that you so quickly get into bilateral disputes. I did wonder how we unpack this tension between security and non-security. I think as was pointed out, it's probably easier to start cooperation on areas of non-traditional security, HADA, maybe some net zero connectivity initiatives, IUU. All of these were mentioned as areas that would be easier than direct maritime security cooperation. But actually, maybe it's also an overlap between the two that's worth exploring. So if you look at, for example, environmental protection, if you're looking at coral reef protections, an area that Australia knows a lot about from the Great Barrier Reef, it would be applicable to coral environments in the South China Sea. It would allow you to have a conversation about something which is actually quite difficult to talk about in any other context because it becomes securitized so quickly. So maybe there's this benefit that you can indirectly approach sovereignty and security issues through some of these non-security access points. I think I was interested by the notion of what whether member states have competency over a certain issue or whether it's best approached at a regional level. It seems strange for someone with a British accent to talk about the EU, but I do wonder whether the EU's principle of subsidiarity, the notion that you do as much at the member state level as you can before you go up to regional cooperation, whether there's something worth exploring there. Obviously difficult when you're talking about common goods like maritime issues, but it is something that other regional institutions have explored at some depth. So maybe something we can learn from other parts of the world. I think there was a really interesting point about energy, not just conceiving that in the traditional way in terms of oil and gas, hydrocarbon, undersea rights, but renewable energies. I did want to draw back maybe on an example from Australia and Singapore. At the moment, there's a cable which is proposed. It's called the. I'll give you the title afterwards in the sidebar. But there's a Powerlink cable. Oh yeah, Australia-Asia Powerlink proposed to be completed by 2029, which would take solar energy from the hot centre of Australia, put it up through Darwin through a submarine cable that would go the whole way to Singapore and should eventually actually provide about 20% of Singapore's power needs. Now, that would cross about 4,000 kilometres of the sea, mainly through the Indonesian archipelago. It creates all sorts of challenges around regulations from the environment and all sorts of standards, as well as the security of the cable themselves, which would be a critical part of Singapore's energy supply. So I think we tend to think of issues like submarine cables, maybe for a data perspective, but they also have, I think, an energy component to them. So I think that's worth focusing on as well. COVID came up. I think that's absolutely critical. It's not just in this discussion, it's been in other parts of the dialogue. It was mentioned that issues of transnational crime have peaked again since COVID. I think we also see it in areas like IUU fishing. I know that there's been an increase in the numbers of IUU fishing incidents between Indonesia and Australia recently. And I think one of the key points there is that many of the capacity building exercises we would normally be able to do have been interfered with by COVID. So Indonesian and Australian authorities would normally be cooperating in villages across the archipelago, explaining to people how to do best practice, legally compliant fishing. It's just not been possible to do that face-to-face since COVID. So there's been a real gap in education and capacity building that we need to quickly close. I don't know how much time I've got left, Joan. Do you want to give me a quick spot check on the time? 2 minutes. Okay, I'll do a few more. So there was an interesting point about whether to convene many of these ASEAN mechanisms under, I think, the ADMM. I guess just one response to that would be that it would, of course, at least in my head, it would securitize the issue and put it through defense ministers. And so, perhaps some of these issues about not being able to have conversations in the first place because of bilateral disputes would be heightened if we try to do everything through the ADMM. But I'm interested in responses on that. I also didn't hear any reference to the code of conduct, which we have heard in other discussions. If we are just going to have, I think it was sort of the argument was that ASEAN plus mechanisms, so mechanisms involving partners outside of ASEAN would be pushed down to talking shop level. Obviously, the code of conduct is proposed as a binding agreement, so I don't know if there's a tension there. And then if I've got maybe 1 minute left, I might just, again, looking at perhaps Australia's as an example, just pick up on that dialogue partner engagement point. I think it's an interesting question whether all dialogue partners should really be viewed as equal in what they can offer in cooperation on maritime issues. I mean, some partners like Russia, I guess, are pretty much absent from any practical cooperation on the ground. I thought it was interesting that Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong, speaking in Singapore recently, and I can share the link if people are interested, sort of alluded to the fact that Australia is uniquely positioned. It believes in ASEAN centrality because, like Southeast Asian countries, Australia is at the convergence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And I think there is definitely a range of capacity and stake that different dialogue partners have. And I don't know if that's something we want to bring out, that actually there are probably some partners that can do a lot more, and we should probably invest more trust in than others. I would particularly note that Russia probably can't offer us much. And then I think that's probably the end of my time, isn't it, Jane? Should I stop there? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bristow, for not only bringing together some of the key points that both our speakers have raised for our discussion hereinafter, but also sharing, from a ASEAN Dialogue Partners perspective in terms of, what is being done and what, can be emulated as good example moving forward. One key thing that I really drew from, all three speakers is the initial recommendation that really we should start from within ASEAN, or at least that's how I perceive, the presentation. Some key recommendation is that we have to first and foremost, try to, if it's to resolve the delimitation, try to start with, within ASEAN. If it's about cooperation, we need to make it better from within ASEAN before, we think about drawing in extra-regional partners as well. And that, I think, is a point that, I think Lanan highlighted quite a bit as well. If I may, just pose one question to both Admiral Ong and Lanan, both from different perspectives. To Admiral Ong, first and foremost, is that, given your experience within the Navy and, talking about cooperation, Navy to Navy, and that, your suggestion as well, has it been a problem in terms of regional countries prioritizing what should be, first and foremost, the areas for cooperation? You highlighted that maritime domain awareness as opposed to what was perceived yesterday by some of our extra-regional partners is in fact a priority and has been, well done. But are there other issues where, there may be some skirmishes or divergences in terms of priority, which you think, Southeast Asian countries should come back together to the table to rethink, their priority? A similar question to Lanan from the institutional perspective, right? You highlighted, in fact, there are a lot of ASEAN and ASEAN-led maritime initiatives already looking at maritime security, yet there are indeed, a lot of overlaps and perhaps, inefficiency in that sense. Having said that, all three speakers today still further suggest more cooperation that is required, right? So in that sense, how do we reconcile the need for us to do better, to cooperate better, to actually be able to manage and good order at sea more broadly, perhaps without introducing more new initiatives? So shall we go to Admiral Ong first?
Thank you for the question, Keng. I believe that ASEAN navies as a community is a has a very strong bond, and cooperation among them is very easy to do. In fact, in my experience, the occasions when we have difficulties is when we need to engage in, let's say, some sort of negotiation, and we have somebody from our foreign ministry watching our back, and that's when we have difficult things. That's when things become difficult. But if you let the Navy people in one room, just give them coffee and they will cooperate and they will talk and they will agree. Okay, so I think just answering Dr. Bristow's concern about ADMM being too securitized, I think that would not be the case. I think we have matured over the years, and we can make a distinction between traditional and non-traditional, and we can work with that spectrum of concerns from the way ASEAN militaries and ASEAN navies think. So I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emerald. Lana, are you with us?
Well, thank you for a very difficult question, Jens. But it's a very good one. There is a dilemma between like functional and strategic cooperation in maritime field. We also have a dilemma between like project-based and grant policy on maritime security as well. But for the efficiency and effectiveness, perhaps we can start with small. We can start with multilateral. We can start with functional first, because when I review all the model of like ASEAN in maritime cooperation, I believe that when we can find the scientists, we can find the correct functional cooperation, then it can result in a very good outcome and achievement. So therefore, if it depends on the objective, of course. If we just highlight on the policy, the goal, then perhaps strategic grant policy will prevail. But if we care about effectiveness, then of course goes more project-based and functional cooperation. Thank you.
Indeed, right. But the challenge as we see it to be is that, once we go down the road, there's always going to be bickering in terms of, who is the key stakeholder, who is the interested agency to come together. And that has been something that, been somewhat problematic within the ASEAN structure, going back to, Rajaratnam Ong's list of challenges that, ASEAN have when we try to push forth more maritime security cooperation and initiative. But perhaps now a question, a rather unfair question to Dr. Bristol, if I may, since you are the only representative of the ASEAN Dialogue partner here in this panel, is that, as ASEAN Dialogue partners increasingly thinking about, more and more new multilateral initiatives, right? Or trying to promote ASEAN minus X approaches. Is this a sense of ASEAN Dialogue partners not being fully satisfied or happy with the existing mechanisms? Because, ASEAN Dialogue partners are part of, a lot of existing mechanisms, from the ARF to the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, all having a place to and existing avenues to cooperate. Yet we are thinking about, and we see on the table a lot of proposal of unilaterals. So what can you say to that, Dr. Bristol?
Thank you. As you flagged, Jane, perhaps an unfair question. No, I'll have a go. So I don't think there is necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily driven by frustration. I think that's what you're asking. Is it because dialogue partners don't feel they're getting enough from the ARF and the EAS and these other mechanisms that they need to create other ones? I think it's, on the one hand, I think it's that these institutions, I believe, can be complementary to each other. I put in the sidebar a link to a recent piece of research which would seem to indicate that actually having multiple institutions looking at the same issue can bring some benefits. But then also, of course, the membership of these institutions will include other partners that are outside ASEAN, and so it's sort of necessary to create some other structures depending on the geography you're looking at. That's not to undermine ASEAN centrality. If you take the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, for example, which I think India has driven, Australia, Japan, I think France and the UK are all supporting different pillars. I think Australia drives the marine ecology pillar, so relevant to today's discussion. I think there's been real steps to make sure that ASEAN is included in that process. And I believe that some of the forums on things like marine ecology were actually done in ASEAN environments first with the help of Singapore before they were done in an IPOI format, or an IPOI format rather. So I don't personally feel, you'll see in the statements of the Quad leaders and ministers when they meet, they will always put ASEAN centrality at the center of what they say the Quad is there to do. So I don't personally think it's driven by frustration. I think it is a reflection that we're working on an Indo-Pacific geography. So ASEAN will always be central to that, but it's not necessary to only work through ASEAN mechanisms. And of course, many ASEAN member states will be part of these institutions, as you describe. And I think ASEAN countries have long decided that there are certain, that being in ASEAN does not prevent them from forming other forms of institutions and partnerships.
Indeed, that's a good message to circulate around within ASEAN and also, with ASEAN dialogue partners. And in fact, I believe that's the message that, ASEAN would like to share with our ASEAN dialogue partners as well, is that, just because we are collaborating with one country doesn't mean that it's to the exclusion of others. With that, may I please invite questions from the floor, from those who are joining us virtually. Both on YouTube, if you type your question into the chat box, somebody will transmit that to us on Zoom. And those of you who are joining us on Zoom, if you can just raise your hands, I will be able to call on you to for you to intervene or to ask a question or a comments to our panelists. Well, I don't see any question yet, so I will continue the conversation because I personally have a lot of questions to the panelists, but I don't want to dominate the airtime per se. But really, I mean, if we can continue with the conversation in terms of China coming up, being mentioned by all three speakers, but in this particular panel, right, the issues set aside, we spent the whole day yesterday talking about the challenges in drawing China in. But this is where, I find that sometimes we might not, the sense that I get is that we are talking across each other. Because when we hear, Chinese speaker speak about maritime cooperation, I think they seem to be very positive and enthusiastic about, the level of cooperation with ASEAN partners, right? Yesterday, we heard Dr. Yan talking about the listing a whole list of cooperation. Yet from the Southeast Asian perspective, it's rather different, right? Whether or not, those listed areas of cooperation is in fact a priority area at all when it comes to, maritime cooperation for Southeast Asia. So this gives rise to question in terms of, are we on the same page when it comes to, what we need to do to enhance trust, what we need to do for cooperation, etc., etc. So a question to my ASEAN colleagues first and foremost, even as we say that if regional at the multilateral level, cooperation is more and more lethargic, it's dragging its feet. But even at the bilateral level, perhaps, if you could share, your experience in collaborating with China or any dialogue partners, right? Whether or not ASEAN is being seen as an equal partner in that sense. Perhaps, Dr. Nguyen first. Lanan, if you could share perhaps a Vietnamese perspective on this.
Well, we are lucky enough to have a very successful cooperation with China in the Gulf of Tonkin, but perhaps the context lead to the cooperation is a little bit different. The maritime delimitation in the Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam were conducted in 2000, and it was a maritime delimitation based on UNCLOS. And after the maritime delimitation, the two countries conclude the cooperation in fishery. And to date, the fishery agreement already expired, but at least we can see that it's kind of an equal cooperation in the sense that it applies the legal regimes of the EEGs of UNCLOS. The two sides will contribute an equal maritime zones to form the joint fishing zones. The two sides will join the joint patrol in order to exercise the law enforcement in the joint fishing zones. However, we all know the fact that most of the time the fishing vessel will come over to the joint fishing zones, but in the part of Vietnam, just because of the fishing resources on the other side is much more than the others. So, but that distribution is mostly based on the natural resources. Other than that, we do have some mechanism to discuss the possibility for cooperation with China, but to date it hasn't come to any agreement or achievement. So that is the only experience that we have, and perhaps the equality that we achieve in that model of cooperation very much based on the root cause of the maritime limitation based on UNCLOS. But whereas in the other part of the South China Sea, it's very difficult to learn the experience from that part, because up to now, China still insists of applying customary law or historic right, which is not provided under UNCLOS. So therefore, it's very difficult to ensure an equal cooperation in that sense.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen, for giving us the context. I think that is precisely, what I was trying to draw out in terms of, when we think about what kind of recommendations, right, we can give to regional ASEAN member states, either individually or as a regional institutions, in how we cooperate. This more often than not, we like to impose, right, best practices and suggestion from outside of the region, yet understanding the regional context often is missing in that sense. And I just wanted to highlight that. Admiral Ong, if I may get back to you, since I imposed that question on you as well, perhaps to share very quickly the Philippines experience as well, not just cooperation with China, but in terms of the experience in cooperating with extra-regional partners as well. Has that often been a positive experience, and whether you feel that ASEAN's priorities has been taken into consideration? Admiral Ong, please.
Thank you, Jane, for the question. In terms of cooperation, I'm sure we have some other areas that we do cooperate with China, primarily on economic issues or investments, business. But for maritime, in the maritime domain, I think we are locked into the arbitral ruling, so that's already a conversational killer in terms of talking in terms of cooperation. So I think we've drawn the line there, and we, in terms of respecting each other's position, and we know that we have differences as far as maritime is concerned. This is the question I actually want to pose, is that when you discussed multilaterals earlier, is that multilaterals do not happen by themselves. It's sort of water seeking its own level. And from the Philippine perspective, as I contextualize in the framework I've done for this webinar, if we are not satisfied with in addressing our traditional security concerns within the framework of ASEAN, we will look for other forums to address that. Okay. Now the question now is, and those are happening, I presume those are happening in other member states also, who share the same traditional security concerns like us. So the question now is, how can ASEAN become a relevant actor, still maintain its presence as a relevant actor in areas that wherein some of the member states are not satisfied with issues that are not being addressed. So they will seek to address them in other forums. Okay. So I think the question is relevance. Okay.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong. In fact, the next person on the list asking a question might be the suitable one to answer the question. Ambassador Ong, and then this is my boss. I see your hand up first. Can we have your comment? But perhaps also, if you may indulge us to address Admiral Ong's question in, how can ASEAN remain relevant? Sir.
Thank you. I raised my hand because I was just triggered off by our Vietnamese speaker's comments about Vietnam and China cooperating in the Gulf of Tonkin, or what the Chinese call Peipu Gulf. Yeah. Because I suppose if there is relative calm and predictability in the Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam with regard to maritime cooperation and maritime activities, perhaps that model or that kind of modus operandi can be applied to some other parts of the South China Sea. Yeah, particularly in the area of fishing and plastic pollution. Fishing is a very critical issue. The way to engage Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam from the ASEAN side is to really talk about how do we ensure fishing fleets from our ASEAN member states do not get into any tight situation or confrontation with Chinese coast guards. Also, Chinese fishing fleets are coming in greater numbers in the South China Sea area. So this is something that we need to think about, because if we just keep on focusing on the security dimension of the South China Sea, we will not be doing enough for our cooperative engagement, ASEAN and China. Moreover, fishing is a very critical issue. And the way we are fishing, according to some studies, in 10 years, there will be no more father fish or grandfather fish. No, it's just baby fish. And that's not enough to sustain our population's appetite for seafood. So how do we go about starting the basic infrastructure for cooperating in South China Sea with regard to sustainability of fish stock and fish supply? Yeah, the Navy and the other military component of our ASEAN member states ought to have a more economic-oriented plan to put across this idea that maritime dispute, yes, but we have a series of confidence-building measures to tackle those things. But at the same time, we cannot wait to operate on how to organize a sustainable fishing regime in the South China Sea. Yeah. So we need to start work on this, and if we are talking about another 30 years of ASEAN-China cooperation, ASEAN economic community and ASEAN social cultural community for the next decade. These are issues which I think the military, defense, Navy people have to engage in. And in this respect, it may be useful also for our own ASEAN sectoral body to look at how the defense and those body in charge of fisheries and maritime pollution can work together. At the moment, I don't believe there is a joint mechanism from the ASEAN side vis-a-vis China. Perhaps it's one area that we can talk about. We call it a six-party talks. ASEAN defense, ASEAN pollution, that means ASEAN environment, and ASEAN economic fishery in particular, fitting with their counterpart in or from China. It's something that we need to talk about, because we are now frozen into a specific confrontational stance over claims, counterclaims with regard to territories, with regard to sovereignty issue, with regard to how we approach the UN law, the Sea Convention. In the meantime, illegal fishing is very expensive, and at the rate we are going, today is what we call the Earth Overshoot Day. At current rate of consumption and growth, we are already way beyond what the Earth can sustain, the number of people on Earth. According to the report in the Singapore newspaper today, this one Earth cannot sustain all the population now exists on Earth. We are already 1.74 over. In other words, the Earth cannot sustain the current population anymore. You need another Earth to come around to help us sustain ourselves. So this is an area of work which I think defense and the non-defense bodies in ASEAN can start thinking about how we go forward. While the legal people keep arguing about who has what sovereignty and what areas can be under the respective countries' sovereign authority, we need to think about cooperation. This is in line with what all of you have discussed earlier about going beyond the areas that of military defense, security. Seriously, we are thinking about how can we engage ASEAN and China in a trilateral setting, defense, security, economic, fishery, and maybe even the social impact and the environment, labor, because fishermen they comprise a big part of the workforce in Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I have to on the list. Next up, Dr. Shafia Muhibat. You have your hands up. Question or comment, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Jane. I just wanted to also chip in on giving comments on the issues that we're discussing right now regarding, you were asking about equality between ASEAN and dialogue partners in terms of projects on maritime security. And I do think that there is a difference when we're talking about individual ASEAN member states' cooperation with dialogue partners and a cooperation at the ASEAN level with dialogue partners. And I think this applies to a wide range of different issues, so not only on maritime security issues. I think at the bilateral individual ASEAN member states and a dialogue partner, there is more equality in terms of, especially for the more technical cooperation, there is equality in terms of the issues that are, or the agenda that is to be set. But at the ASEAN level, I do think that, looking at the experiences, sustainability of ASEAN-led frameworks has been quite dependent on the interests of dialogue partners, especially when we take into consideration that there is this proliferation of ASEAN multilateral processes and platforms, which is very costly. And ASEAN has had very limited resources in maintaining all of these different processes and platforms. And thus, the sustainability of these processes and platforms have also been dependent on the interests of dialogue partners. So, and I think as long as ASEAN is, well, quote unquote, dependent on dialogue partners for the sustainability of these activities, there is limited of what ASEAN can do to actually set the agenda. And this is, I think, the consequence of this is what we're witnessing right now, and I think has also been discussed, the creation of other minilaterals that the dialogue partners might judge to be more beneficial for them. And I do think that this is something that is likely to be the trend in the next decades, and I think also something that ASEAN needs to anticipate and adjust to. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you, Ibu Fifi, for the very somber and realistic assessment on the ground. But I believe that is precisely, the crux of the issue here then, right? How do we ensure that, and coming back to Admiral Ong's question about relevance, how can we ensure that, ASEAN continues to be able to put forth ASEAN's priority rather than, beating to the tune of our external partners who are the one, funding some of these initiatives, right? No good solution there, but indeed, a issue that we have to prioritize. I'm very cognizant that, we are 1 minute to closing this particular panel, but, I do want to give, the panelists a minute or two each to wrap up. So, I'll seek the organizers, indulgence to allow us to do that. If I may, to go in reverse order though, because I see, Admiral Ong's hands up as well. So, I'll give him the final say. Let's start with Dr. Bristol, a short wrap up and some key takeaways from this panel, please.
Well, thanks very much. I think I've sort of been trying to represent all the interests of all the dialogue partners today. It's just obviously a difficult task to do. I think there's been a really good challenge here about why do we have this proliferation of institutions, and why are certain ASEAN members choosing to form minilaterals with countries from outside the region. I'm not sure I think we've had a diversity of opinion. I think it's an area that requires more thought. I guess viewed from Australia's perspective, I think there is a sincere belief here that these are complementary, and that as long as it's a reliable dialogue partner who is showing that they respect ASEAN centrality and is doing this for the right reasons, that there's not much to fear. But I think those are important criteria. I think not all dialogue partners engage with ASEAN on the same basis. We've focused a lot today on China, and I think there are rightly concerns about the way the gap between what China says and what China does in this region. I also think we need to consider whether ASEAN gets much out of its dialogue partnership with countries like Russia, which bring very little practical cooperation to the region. And we don't have time to talk about that in depth today. But yeah, apologies, I couldn't represent all the dialogue partners equally today, but I gave it my best shot.
Thank you, Dr. Bristow. Blame the opportunistic moderator for putting you in a very awkward position there. Dr. Nguyen, please.
Yeah, I think we are living in a very difficult strategic environment. Therefore, in order to promote maritime cooperation, ASEAN need to think in a new way. On the one hand, ASEAN has been successful in maintaining all the ASEAN-led mechanisms that have attracted the participation of ASEAN partners. But on the other hand, the ASEAN partner already formed up some new minilateral initiative outside ASEAN. So in the way to further promote maritime cooperation, as well as to maintain the centrality of ASEAN, perhaps ASEAN needs to think creatively to create the linkage between the current framework of ASEAN and the other coalition or minilateral initiative in order to better coordinate it and maintain the interests of the regions.
Thank you very much for the very sage advice to ASEAN as an institution and also individual ASEAN member states in terms of, how can we push forward the maritime agenda within the region. Iimura Ong?
Thank you, Jane.
You can conclude in 2 minutes. Thank you.
First, I do agree that we need to desecuritize maritime cooperation in whatever aspects. But for the Philippine side, it's very hard to do that, given in the maritime front, that is the heart of the issue between China. That's why we are hoping that ASEAN can take the cudgels in terms of enhancing cooperation through ASEAN, so for Philippines to navigate those issues, because China and the Philippines cannot do it alone. We need others to help us bridge the gap, so to speak. Second, I am personally concerned about ASEAN being dependent on dialogue partners in terms of driving the vision or driving initiatives. I think that opens ASEAN to just a certain level of cooptation, which we should avoid. I think ASEAN should be the one driving the car, so to speak, and heading and telling what direction we should go. Speaking for the Philippines, I think when we do engage with multilaterals, I am aware that it's either the Philippines or it's another ASEAN country that's driving the unilateral, not a dialogue partner, in terms of setting the direction. I take the example of the TCA in Malfi. It was Indonesia driving that initiative, and it was Indonesian Defense Ministry leadership that made it successful. So we do have that the gravitas within ASEAN to do this, and I don't think we should allow external actors to do it for us. That's it. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Iimura, for the very strong message on ASEAN and its member states. With that, I'm apologies to everyone for being a very bad timekeeper. So I won't even attempt to try to summarize this panel, but simply to invite all of you to join me in thanking, our panelists today for sharing their expertise and their time with us to talk a little bit about, maritime cooperation in the limited time that we have. And we look forward to exploring more of these themes in the following panels and within this project. With that, thank you very much, and I'll pass the floor back to Rocky, please.
Thank you very much, Jane, for moderating the session. And thank you as well for all the panelists for the fruitful discussion. We will now take over around 30-minute break. Our next session will begin promptly at 10:40 Jakarta time. The topic of session 5 will be on connectivity. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing all of you again in around 30 minutes.
Hi, Jing Tree.
Ambassador Ong.
How are you?
Hello, Ambassador Ong. Hello, everybody. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Kawai-san, how are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you, Ambassador?
I'm surviving. I'm surviving. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Good, good.
Yong, how are you?
Hey.
Clara
No,
here.
Lara.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay.
I'm
You
a
doing well, I see. Huh?
Oh yeah, I'm a veteran COVID now. Just recovered a week ago. Since
That's good, yeah. Yeah. I had it in May, so now I am certified COVID veteran.
I just joined the.
You just joined the club, yeah.
Yeah.
Kurara-san, how are you?
Iimura-san, how are you? I'm fine.
Are you suffering from COVID-19?
Yeah. 3 weeks ago, I got COVID. I mean, the 7th of July. I remember, I was tested positive.
Oh my goodness!
But I have been recovered since last week.
I see.
How are you? You are in good health too, right?
Me, I'm okay. I'm okay, although I'm getting older and older.
Like anybody else, like everybody else.
Wongi, how are you?
Yes.
Who? Good, thanks.
Korean, Mr. Cho. Yeah.
先生、ありがとうございます、今日は。
よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。ありがとうございます。
お世話になりますが、よろしくお願いします。
Itu Profesor anu ya.
Professor Shinoda, yeah. Okay, Rocky, we better start.
First
So Rocky, so I think everybody is in.
Yes, that is true. I think we can start soon. Let's start the webinar in 1, 2, and 3.
So then we start.
Greetings from Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience. Welcome back to the conference on Towards Open and Inclusive Regionalism. The conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to warmly greet the people who have helped to make this event happening. First, Ambassador Keng Yong from RSIS Singapore. Second, Ambassador Yutaka Iimura from GRIPS. And third, Buklala Juwono from CSIS. Also, I would like to remind participants joining us today at Zoom to take the opportunity that you can access the English-Japanese interpretation feature in the right corner of the application. Now, before further ado, I would like to invite the moderator for this session, Professor Cho Wongi from KNDA. Professor Cho Wongi is a professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, KNDA. He also serves as the head of the Center for ASEAN-India Studies at the KNDA. In that capacity, he leads the KNDA's policy research on Korea's diplomatic approach to Southeast Asia and South Asia. He was a member of an advisory group at the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy under the previous Moon Jae-in administration in Korea. His current research focuses on why and how South Korea engages or not in the Indo-Pacific affairs. Professor Cho Wongi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rocky. Greetings from Seoul. My name is Wongi Cho. I'm very honored to be invited to this conference and moderate session 5. We have 3 excellent speakers from Malaysia, Japan, and Cambodia. The first, we have Professor Cheng Chi Kwek from Malaysia. He's head of Center for Asian Studies of UKM Malaysia. And also we have Professor Masahiro Kawai, Representative Director and Director General of Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia. And also we have Dr. Chihyang Banarith from Cambodia. He's a president of Asian Vision Institute. We have 1 hour for this session, and the topic for this session is connectivity. Connectivity that is defined in broad sense. That includes infrastructure connectivity, institutional connectivity, and digital connectivity, as well as people-to-people connectivity. The organizers provided 2 guiding questions for the discussion in this session. The first one is the challenge that we face in strengthening connectivity among the countries in the region. What would be the sum of the major challenges for countries in the region to strengthen connectivity? That is infrastructure, institution, digital, and people-to-people connectivity. So that is one of the main guiding questions for this session. Another one is policy prescription. So what should we do to strengthen connectivity? So how should ASEAN and its dialogue partners advance connectivity through various economic cooperation programs? So we have these 2 guiding questions, and I expect that the speakers and discussant would address this question in a comprehensive manner in this session. For each speakers, I expect 10 to 15-minute presentation, and then Dr. Banarith will discuss for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor and engage in free discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my good friend from Malaysia, Cheng Chi, please.
Thanks very much, my good friend, Mr. Chairman, Wong Yi. And very good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. I would like to thank the organizers, CSIS Indonesia, GRIPS, and also RSIS for having me here. It's a great honor to take part in this conference series for a second time, and I feel particularly happy to share this panel with Professor Kawai and also Wanarith. So in the next 10 or 12 minutes that I have, I would just share 3 points, 3 points that I hope to reflect Southeast Asian perspective about connectivity cooperation in Asia or Indo-Pacific region. And we certainly understand that Southeast Asia is too diverse as a region to have any one single perspective. So I hope that the 3 points will reflect as much common denominators of ASEAN countries' perspective and also outlook on this important issue of connectivity cooperation. And the first 2 points are about realities, and the third and also the final point about response that I hope to address all 2 questions that highlighted by Wong Yi earlier on. So the first point is about connectivity cooperation. By now, it's clear that it's not just about economic and developmental issues, but it is really a geopolitical reality that would stay for a long time. And the second point I would like to highlight is that the connectivity cooperation is not just about big power push. More often than not, it is also about smaller state pools, small state agency matters. And the third and also the final point is that from ASEAN countries' perspectives, clearly the future of connectivity is about compete to connect, and it is not about compete to detach or disconnect in any form. and ASEAN-led mechanism and ASEAN-led framework, primarily in the form of MPAC. It might be inadequate and in fact, in some cases, ineffective, but it is indispensable for the future of connectivity cooperation in Asia and beyond. First thing first, let me briefly elaborate the first point and the second point before I expand the third point. So as I said earlier on, I think connectivity cooperation is not just a geo-economic issue, but geopolitical issue. Many would be very quick to highlight that, to attribute this phenomena to China's Belt and Road, Itailu. But I think it's also important to say that other powers matter in the process. I think, in fact, I think the credits should be given to the late Mr. Abe. He was I think, the first one, and leading Japan as the first country to realize, to also point out the geopolitical trends of connectivity cooperation. So 2 years after Belt and Road Initiative, Mr. Abe proposed a very important initiative, Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. And he was not just proposing, he was implementing and pushing at various levels, not just unilaterally, but also bilaterally, minilaterally, and also multilaterally through multiple layers of cooperation. For example, he worked very hard to promote and also to convince partners in the region and beyond, primarily early on through member states of Quad, but later on, of course, with United States and also Europe and also G7. So we could see that over the last few years, for example, the geo-economic and geopolitical dynamics converge. We have seen that 2018, for example, EU come up with EU-Asia connectivity, the same year when even Trump, the US, the Trump administration in US also proposed a Build Act. And it did not stop at that level. We could see more momentum have been accumulating in 2021 and also 2022 as we speak. For example, EU has upgraded and expanded and launched by launching the EU Global Gateway. And then we have seen G7 has also launched the BW3, Build Back Better World, and most recently the PGII. And we understand that that's happening at the same time where the Quad members early on were talking about Blue Dot networks. Interestingly, China has also updated its own version. We understand that China early on has proposed the so-called third country cooperation. So meaning that BRI is not just about China and individual countries, but also other partners could work together. And more recently, since the last September, China has seems to updated the mechanism for connectivity by proposing the Global Development Initiative. So I believe that by now it's clear, connectivity is both about geopolitics and also geoeconomics, which brings me to the second point. So in this process and also ongoing dynamics, we could see that it's not just about big power action reaction, but smaller country, the host country agency clearly play some role. I'm not saying like small states whose is the most important factor, but clearly it is an important dynamics that we need to pay attention to, and which means that small state whose are mainly about domestic politics. We say that all politics is domestic, and it is the domestic political needs of the ruling elites in host country that convince them and push them to collaborate with big powers, sometimes more than one. And then Belt and Road Initiative, for example, we could see that small countries are the ones who take initiative. In many cases, for China to collaborate for their own developmental needs and also the elites' political needs. So the key point here, the bottom line point here is that smaller countries are engaged and embrace external powers, China and beyond, not necessarily or not so much because they like China or they like individual powers, but because they need what China, what other powers have to offer, which brings me to the key point that for other powers to really compete with China, to provide alternative that other smaller countries and host country would consider and also embrace, I think we need to bear in mind that good alternative, it's a concrete alternative. Good alternative is available, accessible, alternatives. So a lot of announcement must be translated into concrete cooperative mechanism and scheme in order to entice and also attract smaller countries in the region to collaborate, which brings me to the last and also the final point, which is about the ASEAN-based mechanism. And then by now, I think we can safely acknowledge the limitations and also inadequateness of ASEAN as a group. And as Fifi early on mentioned, I think the cooperation between ASEAN and dialogue partners take place at two levels. One is the individual countries and then ASEAN as a group. For connectivity cooperation, it is very important that in addition and above the individual and bilateral levels, ASEAN as a group must take even more active and also assertive position in order to promote and also shape cooperative connectivity cooperation in the Indo-Pacific era in a less conflictual and a more cooperative and also inclusive way. In order to do that, I think it's very important to emphasize, I think there are a number of risks that explain why it is not just ASEAN countries, but other countries as well, who are worried about the geopolitical driven dynamics where they might result in a risk of polarization, risk of marginalization, and worse, risk of entrapment. I think one recent example would be about, I think many countries welcome more alternative and also more schemes, but some scheme might be exclusive in nature. And chip 4, for example, I think the supply chain for the chips in a semiconductor involving US and also Taiwan, Japan, and also South Korea. We understand that South Korea, for example, is in a dilemma of whether or not it should embrace chip 4. And that's just one indicator of why and how connectivity cooperation might involve a lot of geopolitical risks. And ASEAN countries, as smaller countries, clearly are very concerned about this prospect. So the way forward is that I think there is a great need to update and also upgrade the MPAC, Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity. And that should be upgraded and also expanded along inclusive, impartial, and hopefully also integrative manner. And by integrative manner, in a sense that we know that competition is just a DNA for big powers, existing, rising, and also second tier level. So we cannot deny or pretend that competition do not exist, but clearly we need to leverage on competition in the sense that those competition should happen to connect rather than another direction. And I do think that the MPAC should be upgraded by inviting more powers in and out of the region with all the schemes that we have heard about, the Global Gateway, BW3, and also PGII, in a way that allow ASEAN country as a group and also individually to really promote connectivity cooperation along multi-layered arrangements. Multi-layered arrangement can take place, for example, bilaterally, can also in terms of minilaterally and also multilaterally, depending on the comparative strength of individual powers in and out of the region. It also depends on the developmental needs and also in terms of the political aspiration of the countries involved. With that, I stop here. Back to you, Wong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chang-Chi. You laid out a very broad proposition, 3 propositions about the connectivity. The first, connectivity cooperation is not just economic cooperation, but it's a geopolitical issue. I think this is very, this reflects the geopolitical reality of the connectivity challenge we have, right? The second proposition you made was that small state agency matters, right? So the small states are engaging and embracing big powers in connectivity cooperation. And thirdly, you pointed out that the future of connectivity is to compete to connect. Yeah, and also you raised an interesting point. In order for ASEAN countries to go forward with strengthening connectivity cooperation, you pointed out that you should upgrade and update MPEC in an inclusive and impartial and integrative way. So later in discussion, would you elaborate a little bit more on this issue? All right, now let's move on to the next speaker, Professor Masahiro Kawai, Representative Director and Director General of Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia. Professor Kawai, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cho, for your kind introduction. I am very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Professor Shinoda and Professor Iimura for inviting me to this very important event. I have a PowerPoint to share. I just wonder if I can share my PowerPoint myself. Let me try. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to take a look at this connectivity issue more like some geopolitical perspective, but from also an economics perspective. Particularly, I want to introduce two kind of attempts to measure connectivity quantitatively or numerically, so that we can understand the progress or lack of progress of connectivity. Okay, as everybody knows, this important master plan on ASEAN connectivity, which Dr. Quick also mentioned, was a very big kind of boost for connectivity initiatives. Connectivity is very important in strengthening ties among countries, particularly for physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity. And connectivity is one of the 4 areas of cooperation under AOIP. And connectivity concept has been quantitatively measured by ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting, and also the Asian Development Bank for the respective regions. So we can take a look at these quantitative measures to see the progress or maybe challenge that the Indo-Pacific countries face. And then I want to talk about challenges of connectivity and how these challenges could be overcome. I do not want to spend much time, but ASEM and ADB have compiled various indicators to come up with a notion of connectivity. ASEM provides measures of connectivity for the Asia-Europe region. And we see that Singapore, Korea, Brunei, Malaysia, these countries are high performers of connectivity. whereas Myanmar and Laos PDR are weak performers. In the context of Asia-Europe connectivity, people-to-people connectivity is very limited, particularly for BCLM or countries, particularly Cambodia, CLM, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Philippines. And physical connectivity is very limited for Lao PDR. And then ADB also provides some metrics of connectivity. ADB takes a look at the trade and investment, money and finance, regional value chains, infrastructure and connectivity, people and social integration, institutional arrangements, technology and digital connectivity, and environmental cooperation. Environmental cooperation is considered to be important in the context of connectivity because of the need for connectivity having to be sustainable. So sustainable connectivity is something that many organizations are trying to achieve. ASEAN plus 3 countries. I focus on ASEAN plus 3 countries have achieved relatively strong people and social integration for the Asian region, while relatively weak integration in money and finance and institutional arrangements. And institutional arrangements are particularly limited for BCLM countries. And overall, Malaysia and Korea are high performers, while China is a weak performers. China's connectivity performance is weak relative to its economic size. The ASEM measures and ADB measures are controlled for the size of the economies. Okay. Now, there has been some change in connectivity between 2006 and 2018. The most recent measure for ADB is 2019, which is reported in the most recent ADB report on regional cooperation and integration published earlier this year. But data only available through the ADB website for 2018, between 2006 and 2018, where COVID affected connectivity. So we are talking about the pre-COVID connectivity situation. And we can see some changes. In the case of trade and investment on top of the table, Brunei and Indonesia and also Myanmar have seen big progress on trade and investment connectivity. For money and finance connectivity, Korea and Laos PDR have seen a great deal of progress. Regional value chains, kind of interestingly, Cambodia and Laos PDR and Myanmar have gone back. There has not been much progress on regional chains, regional value chains, or supply chains, which is quite interesting. Infrastructure connectivity, some good progress on the part of China. People and social integration, China has seen a backward move, while Brunei has seen a positive move. Institutional arrangements, Japan has seen a good progress. Technology and digital connectivity, almost all countries seeing very strong growth, improvement. Environmental cooperation, not much. So this is the kind of general trend. Now, challenge, I want to point out 4 challenges. People-to-people connectivity. We don't have numerical evidence yet, but we observe a sudden stoppage of people mobility across borders. So people-to-people connectivity has been significantly disrupted by COVID-19. So restoring people-to-people connectivity will be a big challenge. And of course, countries have to put COVID-19 under control. And then countries have to think about how to promote the movement of people. Because face-to-face physical interactions are quite important in rebuilding trust across peoples and countries. And then supply chains. Strengthening supply chain resilience is a big challenge. We saw that even before COVID-19, some countries did not make progress, but went back in terms of regional value chains. Supply chains are quite vital to manufacturing and to economic activity, but the supply chains have been disrupted by various types of shocks, natural disasters, US-China trade war, COVID, and Russia-Ukraine war, and the Western economic and financial sanctions against Russia. As Professor Kimura noted yesterday, supply chains have been surprisingly resilient in reviving trade and goods. Not trading services, but trading goods. Trading goods has rebounded very strongly from mid 2020. Of course, most recently, the Russia-Ukraine war is affecting trade, particularly energy and food. But the IMF World Economic Outlook noted the importance of supply chains. However, in recent years, important additional factors needs to be considered. Economic security issues, which may lead to some decoupling of supply chains in high-tech sectors, and also requirements by ESG investors to make entire supply chains ESG compliant. And also the United States and a few other countries are focusing on the importance of human rights. This calls for green supply chain management, as well as human right due diligence in the informing supply chains. And multinational companies are increasingly required to address these challenges when attempting to make supply chains resilient to shocks. And they want to diversify their supply chains. And this provides a great deal of opportunities for ASEAN and other Indo-Pacific countries like Vietnam and India to develop secure and reliable supply chains. Of course, Japanese multinational companies are very much interested in diversification. Just some data for Japanese multinational companies. ASEAN is a very important region. It's a third important region for Japanese outward foreign direct investment after the US and EU. And for ASEAN, the lower figure, for ASEAN, Japan is an important supplier of foreign direct investment after US, EU, and ASEAN. So there is a high complementarity between Japan and ASEAN to build and develop more resilient supply chains in ASEAN. And strengthening infrastructure development and connectivity is also important in ensuring long-term economic development. And both lending and borrowing countries of infrastructure financing need to achieve high-quality infrastructure investment. Economic viability from a life cycle perspective has to be taken into account. Openness, transparency, and debt sustainability is an increasingly important issue to avoid debt traps. I just want to show some data. Japanese infrastructure investment in ASEAN is not small. It's as large as China's, particularly in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, and also in transport sector, energy and utilities. One more picture, which is quite impressive. When we take a look at Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, their public external debt, sovereign external debt, China accounts for a major portion. In the case of Cambodia, China accounts for close to 50%, Laos about 50%, and much larger than multilaterals share. Multilaterals include World Bank, ADB, and AIIB. So China, as a single country, is the largest provider of financing. This means that when a country is in debt distress, China and other large creditor countries have to coordinate in resolving debt issues. And particularly, China is not a member of the Paris Club. China is strongly encouraged to join the Paris Club. And my final challenge is digital connectivity. Unlike people-to-people connectivity, COVID-19 has boosted digital connectivity because of the need to pursue social and economic activities without human contact. And digital connectivity has been promoting not only e-commerce and digital services trade, but also digitalization and digital transformation of individual economies. So digital connectivity is a major area that needs to be focused. And deeper digital connectivity requires investment in human capital and ICT infrastructure, and also supporting policies like freer access to internet and data flows, and addressing digital divide. And data-free flow with trust is something that Japan, Prime Minister Abe former Prime Minister Abe were pursuing. But at the same time, cybersecurity and data and privacy protection would have to be strengthened. And regulatory reforms at national levels had better be complemented by bilateral and regional cooperation through FTAs or digital economy partnership agreements or mutual recognition agreements. The promotion of digital connectivity and digital transformation has to be complemented by policy measures to protect those affected, particularly for reskilling and retooling of those affected people. This a list of international agreements, just I skipped. Now, my final point is the importance of Indo-Pacific economic framework. Yesterday, there was some discussion arguing that Indo-Pacific economic framework may not be important, but I take the view that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is potentially quite important. Potentially because negotiations have just started and we do not know what sort of outcome may be obtained. But I think this region can give the United States a chance to develop and strengthen this framework, IPEF, which focuses on trade, supply chains, clean energy and infrastructure, and so on. So there is some potential for this. Not all ASEAN countries are members, but perhaps other ASEAN member countries may join IPEF. So in concluding, strengthening connectivity among countries in the Indo-Pacific region is vital, given the threat of a possible division of the world economy due to the Russia-Ukraine war and US-China strategic competition. And overall connectivity in Asia appears to be improving over time, although there are some areas like regional value chain where progress has not been observed. Challenges in reviving people-to-people connectivity, which is an immediate issue, and strengthening supply chain resilience, infrastructure connectivity with quality infrastructure investment, and digital connectivity, which is increasingly important with data free flow with trust. These challenges also present good opportunities for ASEAN countries to attract more foreign direct investment, to create a hub of supply chains, more investment for infrastructure, and to upgrade its digital economy for digital transformation. Regional cooperation, including ASEAN +3 cooperation and wider Indo-Pacific cooperation, where ASEAN is expected to play a central role with AOIP, is essential to addressing these challenges. Let's give a chance to the US in developing IPEF. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawai, for your very comprehensive presentation. So you identified major areas of connectivity and challenges, right? So particularly, I noticed that the 4 challenges, right? First, the people-to-people connectivity. So how to restore the restrictions from COVID-19? This is a major challenge. And also supply chain resilience and infrastructure and digital connectivity. Well, in the free discussion, I'd like to raise this question for you. So you pointed out that IPF is potentially very important for engaging US in the region, right? So, and also 7 of ASEAN member countries joined and ROK also joined, right? And also you point out that the ASEAN +3 economic cooperation, right? we do have a very elaborated institutional kind of framework of cooperation developed based on the ASEAN +3, right? But for now, it seems to me that because of the strategic competition between US and China, ASEAN +3 cooperation mechanism has not been really kind of functioning very well. So is it possible that you mentioned that, is it possible to make to revive at ASEAN +3 cooperation to make function more kind of actively in a way that would complement with IPF, right? IPF is criticized by China as a kind of exclusive framework, but China is obviously the member of ASEAN +3, right? So if you can kind of have some sort of compatibility between ASEAN +3 and IPF, then that would provide a more inclusive space for regional cooperation. Well, that's my just quick observation, and I'd like to you to address later on. So now let me invite Dr. Banarith. Could you turn on your screen, Dr. Banarith? Okay.
Hello.
Okay,
yes,
great. Would you make your discussion points?
So thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation and insights. In order to address those challenges identified with regards to people-to-people connectivity, I think we have great potential within the region, especially in the context of people movement under the framework of tourism, labor migration, and international marriage. We can see increasing flow of migrant laborers across the region. So that is perhaps part of strengthening people-to-people connectivity. But of course, we need to create a kind of regulation and mechanism to protect the rights and dignity of migrant workers. So that is something that we need to improve in terms of a mechanism and regulations. Second, when it comes to tourism industry, over the years we have seen intra-regional tourists have increased significantly. In the past, it used to be tourists from the West, Europe and the US, Australia, but now within Southeast Asia in particular, intra-ASEAN tourists traveling have increased significantly. So that is a positive sign for regional connectivity when it comes to people-to-people contact. Education, cultural exchange also, I think, have great potential within this region as well. Coming to digital connectivity, this is something very tricky in a way and politically sensitive, because within the context of competition which spreading across the spectrum to technology. So digital connectivity may face a certain constraint with regards to the geopolitics of technology across the region. So this is something that we need to figure out how to create inclusive cyber governance that can create or facilitate digital connectivity across the regions. And here we have different versions of, let's say, 5G technologies and other technology that is critical to some countries in terms of security. So this is something that I think ASEAN need to work more to create a kind of a regional norms and regulation on digital data governance and cyber security, so that we talk connectivity in the regions. When it comes to other connectivity frameworks, such as the physical infrastructure connectivity, I think the Belt and Road Initiative have played a very critical role in infrastructure development and connectivity across the regions. And of course, the the commitment by the Quad members and under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Hopefully, there are more budget financing in terms of infrastructure development. So this is a kind of new sources of financing for infrastructure connectivity. And from ASEAN perspective, we wish to see the complementarity of this infrastructure development initiative, either from China or from the United States or Japan or the European Union. It should complement to regional infrastructure connectivity. But of course, as mentioned earlier about the risk with regards to our reliance on a different source of financing, so that the risk can be mitigated by having more options, so that the small states or developing countries like Cambodia and Laos can have more options to get access to a different source of financing, because I think no one want to rely so much on any single country for financing. So, but they need to have options, available options. So that is a very critical that other countries need to understand how to create more option sources of financing infrastructure, especially for the Mekong country like Cambodia and Laos. So down the road, when we talk about connectivity, we need to understand it in a very comprehensive and holistic manner. As Professor Kawai mentioned, that connectivity from hard to soft infrastructure, connectivity, people connectivity, digital connectivity, and so on. So we need to understand connectivity in a very comprehensive and try to understand connectivity from the complementary perspective. So ASEAN welcome all initiatives that complement to ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. So ASEAN can play that centrality role in this deepening regional connectivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Panarith. In your discussion, I think you raised a very important question, right? So Professor Kawai pointed out in his presentation that in particular, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, these countries has a very high level of debt from China, right? So their level of debt distress is a little bit high. And also Dr. Vanarith pointed out that these countries should have options. They have more kind of options other than just reliance, dependence on China. So then what would be some of the ways that these countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar in particular, can have more options? That's also another important question. So I'd like to have the speakers respond quickly to the questions raised, and then we'll open the floor. Cheng-Chi first.
Thanks very much, Wong Yi. Since Ambassador Ong is here, let me use the example of Singapore-Kunming rail link as an example of how the assertion that the proposition that the future of connectivity cooperation in Asia and beyond should be based on an ASEAN-based framework. And this is and also how the three I's that was mentioned earlier, inclusivity, impartial, and also integrative, can be implemented in the actual ground and taking advantage of all the dynamics, power dynamics that we mentioned. So Singapore-Kunming rail link is actually not new. It was an ASEAN project back in mid-1990s, and it was really about connecting 7-8 ASEAN countries together with southern China. But inclusivity is important. Looking ahead, we know that over the last 20 years or so, Singapore-Kunming rail link has achieved a mixed accomplishment. There were achievements in terms of double tracking, spur line, and also the additional link. But we know that many targeted goals were not achieved in many countries. It's uneven. And this is why inclusivity is important, because of despite the name Singapore-Kunming rail link, I do not think any countries in the region see that as an exclusive cooperation between ASEAN countries and China. So I think Japan, Quad members, other individual countries, powers of the region can actually come in approaching either bilateral individual countries on the bilateral level, or in terms of the ASEAN as a group. For example, we know that every countries and powers have their own comparative advantages, right? So I think in terms of technicality, they can come in to be a useful partner for individual ASEAN countries that are part and parcel of the Singapore Kunming Railing project. And for example, I think also Wanarif mentioned about more options are better. I completely agree, and that's about the more the merrier. So I think Singapore Kunming Railing is a good example to show inclusivity, impartial, and integrative can be done according to the existing ASEAN-based framework. And to relate to my final point, to relate to what Wongi, you were trying to kind of pose question to Professor Kawai in highlighting the complementary basis between ASEAN Plus 3, but also APEF. So I do think that the complementary can be implemented through inclusive, impartial, and integrative way. So what is called perhaps it's what we can call as ABCCC, right? It's about leveraging on ASEAN-based connectivity, ASEAN-based concentric connectivity cooperation. So meaning that we are going to see, and we should encourage the development of a concentric circle of cooperation that on the basis of the ASEAN-led mechanism. And we add the layers, can be bilateral layers, minilateral layers, and also multiple layers according to the comparative strength and also domestic, political, and also development needs of individual countries. Final point is energy connectivity that was asked by Jose in the chat box. I think it's one good example where he was talking about the example of a Singapore-Laos cooperation in hydroelectricity. And he said that he rightly mentioned that by doing that, of course, it increases Singapore's energy needs, but it also exposes Singapore to China's dam policies. And I thought that is a brilliant example again to show that why inclusivity is important in the sense that inclusive diversification would be the norm of the day, where as Singapore try to leverage on hydro energy option. Clearly, there are other options of energy arrangements, for example, solar energies and all that. So it means that you simply have to diversify along the inclusive and impartial way. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the question from the floor. Now, Professor Kawai, would you respond to some of the questions raised?
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with Dr. Quick in terms of the need to strengthen complementarity so that U.S.-China division can be, cannot be widened. U.S.-China competition can be managed. I think that's very important. ASEAN Plus 3 and also its kind of trade version RCEP is a good mechanism to nurture economic cooperation within the East Asia region, but that excludes the United States. The U.S. had the TPP, and U.S. cannot return to TPP, and instead the U.S. has proposed IPEF, and IPEF covers a wider issue than just TPP. So IPEF is more flexible, and many countries joining this IPEF, we can kind of we can try to manage the U.S.-China conflict. Kind of the East Asian countries, other than China, are the cushion countries, so that the U.S. and China, U.S.-China strategic competition would not develop into more serious conflict. Ideally, the US and China can be on the same boat, but it's not possible for the time being. So if all ASEAN countries can join IPEF, then ASEAN can put important agendas on the table for ASEAN for the US-led IPEF. So, this coexistence of IPEF and ASEAN +3 initiative would be quite important. And if ASEAN +3 cooperation initiatives being weakened in recent years, I'm not sure if that's been really weakened. But maintaining ASEAN +3 cooperation is quite important. At the same time, maintaining East Asia-US cooperation would be equally important, and IPEF is an important kind of instrument to do that.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawai. I know that the Singapore is also one of the 7 ASEAN member countries who joined IPF, right? But I remember that last May, Mr. Lee Hsien-loong in Japan said that Singapore is joining IPF, but Singapore is supporting China's bid to CPTPP, as well as Singapore is supportive of China's new initiative, a global development initiative, right? So this kind of inclusive stance. So I'd like to invite Ambassador Keng Yong. Would you like to make some comments on some of the discussion points so far made?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Wong Yi. I think the guiding principle for Singapore's policy outlook is basically, as Professor Kwek Cheng Chui mentioned, the 3 I's. We have to be inclusive. We try to integrate whatever proposal, worthy proposal, measurable proposal into existing frameworks. And also this element of being impartial. Yeah, most of the suggestions from various countries or groupings affecting Southeast Asia, affecting ASEAN, have to be viewed in an objective manner. If it is useful for ASEAN and it can contribute to ASEAN's growth and importance in the overall international or global scheme, the Singaporean approach is to accept it and to work with these proponents of such ideas to make it even more beneficial for ASEAN. The overriding consideration for Singapore in its management of all these initiatives or policy-related studies is to maintain the importance of Southeast Asia economically, geopolitically, and to make sure that multilateralism, which revolve around good rules and rule-making, continue to be given the emphasis that they deserve. Because without multilateralism, without good rules, we will be into a very messy, very competitive situation. And this is the reason why Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong has taken a very constructive approach in articulating the value of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Yeah, we see this a bit far beyond into the digital arena. And as someone said just now or earlier in this seminar series, we need to have a better fix on some of the governance principle or the necessary rules for the new digital 21st century marketplace or the international relations based on all the existing structure that we have. The other important point about Prime Minister of Singapore talking about some of these things is that we have to sustain engagement. Yeah, the idea of having more mega trade arrangements cannot exclude any parties which is actually very important for the growth of our economy, whether regionally or internationally. So China is a very big market for all of us, for Japan, for Korea, for ASEAN countries, for India, and of course, for the Western powers. So how do we incorporate China into our existing framework, whether it is the RCEP or CPTPP or now IPEF? Yeah, each of these framework has a different purpose, and there are differences between them. If we can find a way to engage China in a constructive and mutually respectful and mutually beneficial manner, it will be good for us. So I think the approach of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is to talk about it, yeah, and encourage our regional governments, in particular our ASEAN family, to look at these kind of proposal in a broader context and not just be within a very narrow spectrum of our individual countries' national interests. So overall, it's positive, Wang Yi. I think the important thing is now to look at the good part of all these suggestions and initiatives and try to integrate them as what we are trying to do now. Connectivity in today's session, this particular session of our conference, is not just the framework and idea for infrastructure development, financing, and all that, but it is more importantly how we can integrate everybody, whether under ASEAN framework, ASEAN +3 framework, or APEC framework, and whatever we have. If you look at it, ASEM, which Kawai-san mentioned just now in his comparison of the connectivity metric, ASEM is also very important, and all of these initiatives include China. So how can we find a way to draw the ugly side of competition and contestation into a bit more constructive, mutually beneficial operationalizing of all these ideas? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very relevant point. I think your point nicely fit with the Cheng Chi's argument, right? The small state agents matters, and you talk about the inclusive role of ASEAN countries. So can we expect that the ASEAN member countries later on would join China's initiative GDI?
I think it would be a good idea to participate in some of these Chinese proposals, which are projecting itself on a global scale. Hopefully, the Chinese strategic thinker would start to think about how actually their proposal for such global enterprise can be even more beneficial to China if we include Japan, Korea. Yeah, we are talking about the Asian century. These days, it's not very well spoken of. But if you look at the situation that we have today, in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of proposing new modalities for governance in various contexts in the economic and financial area. China, Japan, Korea, India are critical. And if we continue to play this, I don't want you in here, you can go there, and that kind of policy, it will not be beneficial for smaller states, most of us in ASEAN. And I think in this conference, the last day, last 24 hours or somewhere, we talk about the role of Indonesia. Indonesia is another big economy. Yeah, it's already the largest in Southeast Asia. And going forward, the digitalization of the Indonesian economy is already on the way. And very soon, it will be a major, major player. So how do we cooperate together? We must find the right balance, right mechanism to integrate India, Indonesia with Japan, Korea, and China. And this can provide the necessary, what we call locomotive for a global economic expansion. Yeah, that's how I personally think the world should be engaged in. Not to say that Asians will be always great and demanding, but right now, if you look at the innovative industries, the technological development, based on a mass scale across all the countries, what is happening in China, in India, in Korea, in Indonesia, in Japan, is actually very important for our global economic compact. But unfortunately, now the overwhelming attention is still focused on East versus West, Western ideas for certain governance of whatever economic activities and social development seem to be distracting us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Keng Yong. So now
Excuse me, Professor Wong.
Dr. Moderator.
I would like to share a bit the Cambodian perspective on China Global Development Initiative. So I think Cambodia have already expressed kind of support to that initiative, and now I think
GDI, right?
Yeah, the Global Development Initiative.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And now China has requested to put this on the ASEAN agenda for the upcoming ASEAN China Foreign Minister meeting. So we will have internal discussion within ASEAN, but I think largely, I think most of the member ASEAN would express support to that because it complements to the ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. So whatever we do within ASEAN framework, we need to make sure that those initiatives complement to ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity, and we try to maintain this centrality role of ASEAN. So as Dr. Cheng Chi mentioned, ASEAN kind of concentrate or ASEAN focus or ASEAN centric connectivity cooperation. So this is something we try to do. But of course, I think within ASEAN, we need to have a lot more consultation when it comes to connectivity projects in order to maintain our centrality role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are already past 10 minutes. So I'd like to invite the two speakers to make final comments before concluding this session. So Cheng Chi.
I have no points to add. I think Ambassador Ong and also Wanarif have already captured and kind of sum up the issues very, very well.
All right. Thank you. Professor Gawai.
Okay. My presentation was too long, so I do not want to speak too much here. But there was a comment in the Q&A part about the bad aspect of connectivity. I think connectivity, increasing connectivity is good. But there occasionally there are side effects, financial connectivity is good, but too much capital inflows and outflows, can lead to financial crisis. People-to-people contact is good, but communicable diseases like COVID could spread easily. So capital controls may have to be introduced, or behavioral restriction on people's movement would have to be imposed. Connectivity has to be cut. So I think policymakers have to pay attention to the negative side effects of connectivity. And when increasing connectivity, policymakers have to be always aware of the possible side effects and how to manage those side effects. Just one more question issue which Dr. Wanandi raised. Developing countries, small developing countries need options for infrastructure investment. And I think now developing countries are in excellent position to invite China, Japan, the US, Europe, Australia, and so on to finance investment. But at the same time, this investment connectivity, infrastructure investment connectivity may turn out to be bad if investment is not done on a proper basis. So sustainable investment or quality investment would have to be taken into account. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Kawai. So I'd like to thank everybody. I think we have had excellent presentations and raised some of the most important points about the ASEAN's role as an inclusive kind of player who would kind of make China-US competition more kind of compatible with enhancing regional connectivity. All right, so now with this, I conclude this session. So I would like to thank everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Wongi, for moderating the session. I thank you to all the panelists for the fruitful discussion in session 5 on connectivity. We will now take some break. Our next session will begin promptly at 1 o'clock Jakarta time. The topic of the next session is on Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing all of you again back here at 1 o'clock.